Hi, everyone. Welcome. Our names are Luis Javier Pentón Herrera and
Agnieszka Kałdonek-Crnjaković.
and today we're presenting about emotions and feelings in language teaching and learning. And to get us started, we're going to go over these questions that we have here for you. Why are emotions and feelings important in language learning and teaching? Why do we need to talk about them? And why should we research them? And to answer these questions, of course, we want you to also think about this, but something that we can share with you is that historically, traditionally, emotions and feelings have not been part of the language teaching and learning classroom. Instead, we have focused more on academic performance, academic related considerations of language teaching and learning, and important feelings, important emotions like motivation, like frustration, have stayed in the kind of peripheral area of language teaching and learning, but we have learned recently throughout a lot of research that actually emotions and feelings do play an important part, an important element of language teaching and learning, specifically emotions, the emotions and feelings of motivation. For example, without motivation, we've been learning more and more that there is no successful language teaching and learning. So my part here, I have divided into two main parts. First, in the next slide, we're going to see a background of second language acquisition. And in this part, I'm going to give you a very, very brief overview about second language acquisition, always focusing on English language teaching and learning specifically. But I'm going to start with the next slide here. Questions, second language acquisition, SLA, 6 to answer. Second language acquisition is commonly used, this term, in the field to refer to the process of learning or acquiring a new language. And some of the questions that second language acquisition answers, and if we can continue going in this slide, is what does the language learner come to know? How does the language learner acquire this knowledge? And why are some language learners more successful than others? So we have always been, and especially more recently, that we have become more aware of the effect of emotions and feelings in the language classroom. We have become very, very interested on answering these questions and how can we answer these questions to better help language learners. Now, in the next slide, I have a very brief overview here of when we think about second language acquisition, learning a new language, some of the theories that come into consideration or that second language acquisition educators we rely on or we go back to for theoretical support. And we look at theories in psychology, in the fields of linguistics and sociology, for example. So when we think about second language teaching and learning, really the field is very multidisciplinary. We kind of go back to different disciplines and we draw inspiration from them to understand our realities in our classrooms. Now, in the next slide, we have a very brief overview here of starting a new language, foreign second language throughout times, right? In the 1940s and 50s, we had a more empirical or behavioral paradigm approach towards language teaching and learning, where we thought that it was more about behavior and how to teach and learn a language was usually more traditional in the sense that it was a lot about repetition, memorization. But throughout the 60s and 70s, things started to shift a little bit. And then we started going into what we call the cognitive paradigm. And we have here, Noam Chomsky is one of the biggest names when we think about cognitive paradigm. And this idea of the universal grammar and the fact that human beings were programmed to learn languages from Chomsky's perspective, because of our brains are programmed to just absorb language. And we have this idea that because we're human beings, if we're exposed to the language long enough, we're just going to absorb it and it's going to be part of our vocabulary. We're going to naturally acquire that language. But then towards the 1980s, we started to shift into a new paradigm, a new way of looking at language teaching and learning. And Bakhtin and Vygotsky are two big names in this social cultural paradigm. That's the new paradigm. When we started to look more deeply at the social cultural implications of language teaching and learning. So for example, in the next slide, we have here in some constructivist or social cultural perspectives, and two big emphasis during this time, the idea that language teaching and learning, specifically language learning, it's really a social process. It's something that happens in social contexts. Well, there are many emphasis right now in areas of research and importance when we think about social cultural paradigms, but two main emphases that have emerged in recent years are affective concerns within second language acquisition, emotions, well-being, feelings. How do they play, what's the role in language teaching and learning? Also, the second emphasis here is language acquisition as a social process. Again, when we think about learning, especially learning a new language, what is the social implication of learning a new language? When we think about cultural factors, identity, we have become very interested in these elements under the social cultural paradigm. Now, in the second part of my presentation, I'm going to share with you a little bit of information about learner psychology in second language acquisition. And I would like to start with a very short paragraph from a chapter that I wrote in a book. So in the next slide, we have here, this comes from Critical Storytelling, Multilingual Learners, Multilingual Immigrants in the United States. And it's a chapter that I wrote in this book. And I said here, Evelyn, a classmate, and I were practicing in English the new vocabulary words we had just learned, while Mrs. R, our English as a second language teacher, talked to a colleague. Mrs. R stopped talking to her colleague and yelled at Evelyn and me. "What are you two doing?" "Miss, we're practicing English," I shyly replied, while Evelyn proudly smiled in agreement. Mrs. R laughed out loud in front of the class and exclaimed, "Yeah, right," giving us a contemptuous look. My heart sank in uneasiness and disappointment. Evelyn's smile withdrew from the remainder of the school year at Mrs. R's class. And again, this is a chapter that I wrote about my experiences learning English and a few more things that I have in that chapter, but it really speaks to the role that emotions, feelings have in language teaching and learning, the role that also teachers have and the role that teachers play in perhaps, emphasizing or encouraging positive interactions, positive emotions in the process of language teaching and learning. As a student, when I was in high school, after this incident, Evelyn, my classmate, and I, we stopped participating. We felt very demotivated, and that certainly affected our not only participation and motivation in the English classroom, but also our acquisition, because we became very disappointed and just very kind of demotivated. So definitely our grades suffer as well. We were just not very open to learning in that environment anymore. So this is just one story, but it's something that really happens every day in English language classrooms around the world. So it really speaks to not only the feelings and emotions of students, but also of teachers. What can we do to understand those feelings and emotions better so we can make sure that we encourage and we provide a learning environment that actually motivates students and gives them positive feelings and emotions in this process of language acquisition. So a little bit of overview in the next slide about learner psychology. What is learner psychology? So when we think about the psychology of learners in second language acquisition, we must acknowledge that all students are different. It requires that we each, as teachers, teach them differently. So we cannot teach all students the same way, right? We have to recognize that every single student is different. They have their own differences, okay? And historically, I know in academic environments, we tend to emphasize academic achievement using standardized testing and things like this. But, if we really pay attention to students' differences, then we can really tailor our instruction to meet their needs and to also emphasize positive and encourage positive interactions. And above all, we want to keep them motivated and create positive feelings connected to their language learning development. And then in the next slide, I have some differences and affective concerns that teachers can take into account when teaching English as a new language. And I just brought here 6, but there are many more. But personality, are students introvert or extrovert? For example, Language aptitude. Some students just have the natural ability of learning a new language. Some students might require a little bit more work. That doesn't mean that one is better than the other. It's just the natural language aptitude, right? Motivation, this is important, very, very vital for language teaching and learning, specifically language learning. Without motivation, there is no language learning. Learning styles. We can look at Gardner's multiple intelligences here, for example. Emotions. What or how students are feeling. Are we providing a learning environment as teachers that creates positive emotions, that creates positive memories for students? And also emotional intelligence. Are we emphasizing, are we opening discussions about our abilities to self-regulate emotions? This is very important, by the way, emotional intelligence, because many times, and this is a very common experience for language learners, we experience frustration or disappointment or all of these undesired emotions that we do not want, but they certainly affect our language learning process. As teachers, are we giving them strategies? Are we teaching them tools that they can use to regulate those emotions and come back to the language learning process and feel more positive emotions that are going to lead to motivation and future engagement? So these are some things that we have to think about when we think about individual differences for learners' psychology. Then in the next slide, Aga is going to take us into the topic of teachers' emotions and feelings.
Lovely, thank you, Luis. So yes, I'm going to talk, so Luis talked about learners, I'm going to talk about teachers and their emotions and feelings. And I'm going to focus on two aspects. About dyslexia and ADHD. These are kind of two areas of my research. And just to introduce what dyslexia is a difficulty in acquiring reading, in other words, decoding skills and writing, encoding skills or spelling. Whereas ADHD, this abbreviation means attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder. So here we're dealing with difficulty related to concentration and extensive movement and impulsivity. So I did a research study with a colleague from Croatia, and actually this research didn't actually concern emotions as such, but when we were analyzing the data, we actually noticed that there is a lot of emotions going on there, right? So teachers during interviews talked about how they feel, what their concerns are, etc. So just teachers see students with dyslexia as successful learners, but at the same time see them anxious and disengaged learners. And here there are differences between secondary school students and primary school students. So successful learners are more secondary school students, whereas anxious, disengaged learners can be found more in primary schools. So teachers position themselves as supporters of students' efforts and responsible for students' well-being. In other words, conclusively, we can say they have a very caring attitude. Just a bit what the teacher said. So this is an account from a secondary school teacher who talked about her son, a primary school student with dyslexia. So his mom said, now he lacks motivation and this worries me, okay? Sometimes I feel sorry for him, right? But at the same time, this is when she continued talking about her son. She said, when I look at my students with dyslexia, the students in the secondary school, I believe one day he can learn English well. They're really good, especially speaking. I believe I need to be patient. Okay, so the emotions here in this narrative account are hope and patience. Moving on, now I'm going to talk about English language students with ADHD, and I'm going to refer to my studies. One is language teachers and their emotions when teaching students that exhibit ADHD type behaviors. This is a paper in preparation, and a presentation that I gave this year on creating equal opportunities during the conference, for students, an inclusive language classroom for students with ADHD. And what I'm going to focus on is the effect of teacher training on teacher emotions and agency. Okay, so let's just talk briefly about teachers' emotions in the context of ADHD. As you can see, the top emotion, the first emotion they experience is frustration, right? So even when you look at the numbers, 20 is like numbers of incidents, but it's in terms of percentage, it's almost 40%. Compared, let's say, to anxiety or irritation, and with positive ones like hope and understanding, which definitely need to be mentioned. However, I also ask them about emotions, okay? So I ask them about the first emotion, but also ask about what other emotions they experience. And the top emotion here was patience, right? 42 incidents, which makes almost 11%. The one I marked in purple, right? So these are kind of positive emotions, which I would like to highlight here. So we have understanding, fascination, caring, tolerance, and enthusiasm. Of course, there are other emotions, negative emotions like tiredness, powerlessness, frustration, irritation, anxiety, helplessness, impatience, and confusion. And I'm going to continue with that because there were also fear, anger, annoyance, disappointment, but hope, a bit of hope, satisfaction, wonder, disillusion, guilt, despair, and sadness. Okay, so this is a great combination of emotions. So in other words, I mean, we cannot really talk about single emotions that describe this relationship or what emotions teachers experience while teaching students with ADHD. Now I'm just going now to talk about the course. So I taught a course to teachers of English at one of the universities here in Poland. And the course actually concerned ADHD and how to teach students with ADHD. And so I'm kind of measured or asked those participants about their emotions before and after the course. So here what you see right now on the slide is the before, okay? And that concerned inattention, which is one of the presentations of ADHD. The top emotions, which are marked in red, are anxious and frustration. And I also marked patience, which she followed. So again, we have a good balance of positive and negative emotions. Other emotions that they were experienced by teachers were powerlessness, guilt, confusion, ignorance, motivation. So motivation also is very important. Luis, you talked about motivation. I think I'm going to comment on that later as well. So let's just now look at the emotions that teachers experience after the course, right? So the top one was frustration. And then when you look at the positive emotions, motivation and patience, compared, let's say, to what's before, especially this motivation is kind of important to mention here. So in conclusion, before the course, in terms of inattention, okay, this is what I'm going to highlight, inattention. So before the course, we had 27.5% positive emotions and feelings. And what's important to mention here is that 4 participants didn't answer, right? They didn't express any of the emotions. And actually, when I analyzed both accounts of the before and after, you could see that that the teachers didn't want to actually talk about emotions before the course. The top one was frustrated, being frustrated and feeling frustrated, but still anxious, right? When you look at after the course, the percentage really is high for positive feelings, and this is why I said motivation was one of the top. Again, teachers were more willing to express the emotions. They talk about that, so I had longer answers to analyze. Still, there was a frustration with the top, as you can see, 24 against 37, and anxiety as well. And my conclusion on that is like they were more willing to express their feelings, and probably they had a higher agency. Positive feelings were more present, but still we cannot ignore the negative feelings here, right? Because frustration or anxiety are very important. Now let's just look at hyperactivity and passivity. This is the second manifestation or presentation of ADHD. So these are the emotions which are mentioned by the teachers before the course. So as you can see, anxiety and frustration were the top emotions. Again, patience, to balance those feelings. Other were motivation, powerless, confusion, distraction as well. Let's see what happened after the course. The top were anxiety and frustration as well, as you can see, with even higher numbers, okay, and impatience with the same number. Other emotions were confusion, distraction, powerlessness, and motivation as well. So I would say, a big change. And let's just look at the comparison. So before the course, 29% were positive feelings, and 3 participants didn't answer. Frustrated was the top, anxiety was the top, and patience as one of the positive emotions compared to the anxiety feeling. And after the course, actually the positive feelings dropped to 23%, 23.5%. Again, I got longer answers, and frustration, anxiety were the top answers, patience the same time. My interpretation here is more willing to express their feelings, even those negative feelings, okay? Teachers were not properly afraid of expressing those emotions. Okay, and just I would like to show you some accounts, narrative accounts of the teachers, so what they say, what they said. Okay? So the first one is, I tend to blame myself for not giving clear instructions or better prepared tasks, but I also feel bad for the students as I have to grade his or her paper. I usually have mixed feelings about the situation. On the one hand, I feel discouraged and nervous, but at the same time, I feel sympathy not knowing the reason for his lack of attention and want to help him, her, somehow to concentrate. Frustrated again, and even angry and annoyed if the student is disturbing other people. I will also feel like I'm not doing a good job, thinking that he gets bored because the rhythm or because I'm not clear enough. So what the teacher said after the course, I feel positive because I have the knowledge how to react, a bit helpless, confused and angry, but at the same time motivated to help him or her to do better next time. When students make repeated careless mistakes, it can be irritating because you know that their difficulties are not related to skills. They have the ability to do the task. Right? I think these are very powerful words and showing a mixture of emotions and also emotion labor at the same time. Okay, so at the beginning of our presentation, we asked those questions, and why are emotions and feelings important for language learning and teaching? Luis already talked about that a bit. We asked those questions about why do we need to talk about them and why should we research them, just because of teacher well-being, right? So teaching is not an easy job, and as you could see, there's a lot of emotions going on, positive, negatives, a mixture of emotions, and that causes a lot of emotion labor. So if teachers can actually express an emotions and are not feeling that they shouldn't be saying anything about the emotions, they definitely will be better at their work, right? So we're talking here about teacher well-being. So if teachers are better, then definitely learners are well and better. So we do have kind of a relationship between those two, right? And eventually, it will benefit the learning and teaching classroom setting, right? And I think, Luis, we are done. Yeah, that's right.